that is almost totally finished. And then we also are putting the names together of the higher education college and career ready panel. And some of you submitted names, and those persons should be serving in a capacity with this process. And then, so you can see that we're going to be, we're getting ready to have those meetings soon to start this process, and much of it, some of it will be electronically based, some of it will be in person. And we will be getting the legislative report, I believe, soon. I think they just had their last commission hearing. I'm not sure they have an actual deadline. I think sometime in October we're supposed to get that. So we'll be getting a recommendation, and you will get that as well. And we're going to start that review process. So we're working from the base of the 2010 adopted standards, which in Indiana were the basic Common Core. No changes to them at all, just the Common Core as they existed. So we're going to be looking at those standards and gathering all the information just like we did through the other standards revisions, and going about that process. And we're going to report back to you every month as to the progress and different things that we can report to you on this process. It was recommended that we have the public hearings. That is added into 1427. That is not part of statute, but it's an addition this time as we review the standards to have 3 public hearings. I proposed to you earlier that we do that. I actually shortened the timeline, and we have a proposal. If you could look at what I gave you, the draft presentations. We want to present the draft presentations to the Education Roundtable as early as January, and then again in February. And then we also want to bring it out to the public hearing in February as well, so that people can see what are the proposed changes to the document that they were actually looking at. Then it would go back again in March to the round table after those processes, and then they would make a recommendation to you as the State Board of Education. But you're going to be kept in the loop the entire time as we go through that. So it is proposed that in April we will have, the recommendations will be brought to you, and that you will approve the standards in April, so that we may get out information to the schools even before school is out for the school year. Along with that, let me talk to you about the assessment. It takes time to do the procurement and the RFP process and all of that for assessment purposes. We also have to have study on assessments and talk about which directions that we're wanting to head with assessments. And so let me talk to you about the plan, though, that the Department of Education already had in place to transition from our ISTEP to College and Career Ready standards. As you know, that process was supposed to already happen and occur in 2014-15. We would be doing College and Career Ready assessments. That timetable was moved back a year. So the decision, the assessment department made the decision to not begin that transition process until this spring. So it's already been developed, but as we go through this standards revision process, well, we don't need it for this year. It's called Core Links, and it's really a series, it's questions that have already been vetted to be field tested. And it is around college and career readiness pieces, and those can be adjusted depending upon what we do with standards. Field testing those, and then the following year, once we have the standards all decided, the following year in 14-15, there actually can be more college and career ready type of assessments, and I'm talking about types. I'm talking about not all multiple choice, perhaps different levelings of difficulty and rigor, and we're talking more rigor to the questions that would be in the ISTEP format. And that was the plan all along, and I don't really know that we need to change that plan. We have to somehow make sure that our students are ready for college career types of questions that are going to happen in 2015-16. So I'm bringing it to you to discuss because that was the plan all along, and I'm needing to have some direction as to how to proceed.
Okay, so I'm
Core,
what is
Carrie?
core length?
Michelle, is she still here? Thank you, Michelle. I'm glad you're still here.
But I mean, it's a test.
Their questions, yeah. I also made this similar, I sent you the PowerPoint that I gave in testimony to the commission, and this was part of that testimony. I did not go into great detail. Michelle was there to ask questions as well, so.
Sure. Ms. Neal, do you want to repeat your question?
Oh, no,
I-
no,
it's
Carrie
I
asked.
did
Sorry.
not know what Core Links was, and I guess I'm just kind of at a loss for words here. If this is
What
the
is it
test
he's
that's,
taking it?
if
What
this
is he
is the
taking?
test that's replacing iStep, and I guess I didn't know that we had decided, I mean, I guess it was still up to the board, I thought it was still up to the board to decide, once we decided on standards, whether we were gonna do PARC or Smarter Balanced, or what, or make up our own test, and I guess.
Yeah, let me give you
I'm
some
a little
background
off.
about Core Link, and then maybe you'll have some
Okay.
specific questions you'd like to ask. Will that work?
That's perfect.
So in the spring of 13, we actually had planned to administer what's called Core Link, and it is a product of CTB, I'm sorry, the Department of Education, and it was optional for schools if they wanted to participate. Basically, what it was is a chance for students and teachers to see technology-enhanced items, the type of items that we're going to have in the future, and also to be getting kind of a gauge, I would say, on how students are doing in terms of college and career readiness. The original plan was actually to administer it after iStep. Again, it was optional. It was a matrix sample, which basically means that every student wouldn't be taking every item. So it would be an opportunity for students to participate and to get a flavor of the assessment. What we actually did, as the superintendent has alluded to, is once the Common Core was put on pause, it was prudent to go ahead with the Core Link assessment because we didn't know for sure what our standards would be moving forward. So one of the things we're interested in doing as an assessment office is looking at the opportunity to administer Core Link in spring 14 to be able to, again, help teachers get a handle on how well students are doing in terms of content, that is college and career readiness, for students to have access to the types of items that they'll see in the future. This could, that's correct.
There's a lot of talk here about teachers are getting too many tests. This is optional. Who pays for it?
So it's actually part of our contract with CTB. Great question.
It has been.
Uh-huh.
Has it
And
really?
and because it's a matrix sample, it's a very short session for a student. Again, a student would take some math and some English items, but not like an entire session, if you will.
Has it ever been taken in Indiana schools before?
No, our content specialists have actually reviewed all of the items along with the assessment editors at CTB.
And when was the
Um,
contract, this was part of this contract we have right now?
Yes,
With-
that's correct. It was part of our renewal in 2 years ago, whenever that was, 2012.
And
11, 12.
if I might just stop here for a moment,
Sure.
because I think as a superintendent, I was surprised. Because what was developed at the Department of Education was a plan to transition not only from our Indiana academic standards to college and career ready standards, but there was a robust plan to transform from our ISTEP test to college and career ready assessments. That really is prudent that the department do that because you have to have a way to transform so students are ready for whatever it is that they're being asked to do. So this was in place, this has been in place, and to be honest, I didn't know it was in place. So now, when I found out that it is in place, I'm bringing it to you because we do have to know how we're going to transform from our ISTEP assessment to college career ready assessments. So I'm bringing it to you because it's an option that's in place to field test some questions. It's optional, not everybody does it. It's a sample of questions, but it starts the process for the more rigorous types of questions that students are going to experience in 15, 16. The other thing that I think everyone needs to know, because I'm all about transparency, is that our test now, the iStep now, there's great overlap, like huge overlap, with Common Core and our old Indiana academic standards. And so we're already testing Common Core types of things or college career ready types of things. What we're not doing is giving kids the rigor of the assessments, of the types of questions, the application portion, in that framework within our test. So we have to find a way to get that kind of rigor into our assessment at some point. So I'm letting you know, just like I just found out, that this has been part of the plan all along. And so we're bringing it to you here to be open and transparent about a transition process.
While we're open and transparent, what's the law and the rules, or who makes what decision when on terms of assessment standards, and yet the assessment? In the past, the board decided on the ISTEP contract. Those all came up here. How does it work?
So there are two different, sorry.
While she's coming up, I'm going to clarify. What we're giving to you today has been in the contract for a few years here now with CTB McGraw-Hill. It's been the plan, just as the transition plan to roll out the standards was in place, there was a plan for assessments to be rolled out as well.
So under 2032-5, there are two different provisions. One's -4, one's -5, but the State Board of Education authorizes the implementation of, quote, ISTEP. That's actually the language in the statute. And then the Superintendent of Public Instruction implements the ISTEP program and delivery. And there's certainly two different responsibilities that work very closely together, from authorization to implementation. Where this fits in and part of ISTEP in that language, I'm just learning this. I do wonder, just as someone who's been familiar with things going on in Indiana and working in education, that we were originally planning to do PARC, and I wonder if this was part of the plan to transition us to PARC, because my understanding of this new assessment is that it is Common Core aligned, which is what PARC would have been, and this was probably a way to do that.
And that is true, and college career assessments now are delayed a year. So that is
So
true.
This is not the test that's the end-all test once we've
No,
decided.
not at all, not at all.
It's a way for us to transition
Andrea.
to meet federal requirements.
I'm going to have to leave because I have a parent-teacher conference at 4, and I don't have a way to get a hold of them. I just want to say before I go that it seems to me the legislative intent was to pause implementation of Common Core, and that it would seem an unnecessary step to go ahead with a transition test if we're in the process of review. Better to, rather than burden teachers with a second test in the spring cycle, better to just wait and continue with ISTEP as planned. That's my thinking on the subject.
And Michelle may want to speak to this, but we do have a federal requirement that we have to meet in order to meet federal statute. We have to provide a college and career readiness assessment by 14-15. And so one of the things that we were looking at doing is trying to combine ISTEP with CoreLink to possibly fit that need.
Do we know that ISTEP does not meet a college career readiness standard?
So it's aligned to our Indiana academic standards, which, as the superintendent pointed out, are some of the standards. But until we know what our standards
Okay,
are,
but-
it's hard for us to build a test.
But our
So-
current test may indeed be college and career ready, or college preparatory
I think parts
ready.
of it could be, sure.
But we don't know because we've
That's
never
correct.
asked.
Go ahead.
This may be a question for Superintendent Ritz. I want to know, I understand what you're saying about the federal government, but who determines whether or not Indiana standards are college and career ready? Because it feels to me like we're constantly being forced down this tube that if we don't embrace Common Core, then we're not college and career ready. And I cannot believe that we're going to, as a state, just say, oh yeah, we got to do that because of the federal government. I'm not comfortable with that. So who decides that?
No, that's the whole purpose of the College and Career Ready Higher Education Panel, for me establishing that, because the only group that makes that decision is your higher education group. And so that's my sole purpose in creating that panel that's going to look at our standards and deem them college and career ready. So, yes.
I appreciate that because one of the areas of Cognate in my doctorate is curriculum instruction. And since I've been getting all the letters, I decided to go in and take a look at the Common Core. And I have some real concerns in math, particularly in the younger grade levels. And I would hope that the committees are going to look at it, including the higher ed committees, they're going to look to make sure that the standards are solid in content, free of bias, and don't imply a pedagogy in them. And I'm telling you, in some of the Common Core areas they do. And it gives me more concern than I had even 2 years ago when I'm seeing what's in there, because typically assessments follow the way the standard's written. So getting the standards right is kind of like building a house and getting the foundation right. And I understand there are people here who voted for the standards. I get that. But new information's come to light that I can't just ignore. I'm going to look at it, and I want to make sure the committees are looking at it eyes wide open.
Well, as superintendent, I've been pretty open that we need to definitely take a very strong look at mathematics. And so I'm right in line with making sure that happens. And I want to ensure that we are going to have college and career ready standards. And so that's why the creation of the higher education panel to go alongside with us the entire time. So now, I didn't bring this to you for any kind of action at all, but at some point, we are going to talk about it again. But I wanted to be sure that you are knowledgeable that not only was there a transition plan written that was to go for the standards, there was a transition plan all along to go to college and career ready assessments. So that we will have to be talking about that at some point, because we do have to prepare our students to have more rigorous questions and more rigorous types of college and career ready assessments before they actually take it. So we want to keep those things in mind, and as we go forward, it will direct the department and give me ideas on how we want to move forward. The ISTEP test, just like the science that you just did with the cut scores, we had a whole new test. We had a whole new assessment. We had new standards.
Right.
So that's why, and we piloted that, we field tested that for a year. Was it 2 years?
For 1 year.
For 1 year.
Teachers have a year
So
to.
I'm really kind of talking about the same thing, that we have to do things in order for kids to feel comfortable with the next level of assessment. And so we just did that with science, and then we just made the cut scores for that. And so it's the same kind of process that's been in place for other times we've done it. But I just wanted to let you know it was already there, and I wanted you to be knowledgeable about it because I didn't sense you were. So I want you to be, because I wasn't. Now we're ready for, thank you so much, Michelle.
Sure.
Now we're ready for board operations. We have SBOE staff updates and followed by the November meeting dates. Do we have any reports that are needed? Oh, thank you, Ann. You changed your chair.
Computer died. The crazy battery only lasts 5 hours, so. Good afternoon. I will be very brief. Just some brief updates. I wanted to just share that I think timely to some comments that were made earlier in the course of the meeting today. There have been a lot of comments from board members regarding shared governance and the 10 days for action items, and just that the board has been sharing concerns that, I should say comments, that with all of the critical work that's in front of the board, A through F panel and accountability, the Common Core standards and the pause and the review in 1427, and then the assessments that go with that, there are so many timelines and there is such timely work that I have been getting comments, both phone calls and emails from board members saying that the 10 days for action items prior to an agenda is very challenging because the board members are very concerned that they want to make sure that they can get things on an agenda timely so that they can act timely. And so there's been comment that they would ask that that should be revisited, the shared governance, so that that can be discussed to make sure that everything that the board needs to do, that the board can do in a timely manner. So I just wanted to report that I've been getting a lot of feedback on that very recently. And then also, I do know related to the agenda, we've had lots and lots of conversations, and I appreciate the superintendent's time last week. We were able to have, I think it was a very lengthy 2.5-hour meeting to talk about the agenda. Prior to that, the chief of staff had met with me. We'd met for another hour and a half, I believe it was. I mean, lots and lots of time to plan the agenda. I appreciate the time of the superintendent's staff to work on that. I do know that based on some of the comments that board members were concerned that there were some items that were not included in the agenda or where they were requested. So I know that that's something that I will continue to work with the department staff to help work in a collaborative fashion to make sure that that those are all in alignment with what the board is wishing, the full board is wishing. And then also finally, and again, I apologize, I'm being quick, but I want to be very respectful of everyone's time so late in the day. Just for the sake of the record, I also wanted to share the email that I know that everyone received, I believe it was late yesterday afternoon, from Representative Baining, the memo regarding HEA 1005 and remediation, just so it could be added to the record for the minutes. And so I was just going to read that briefly to go through that. So Representative Baining sent a memo yesterday to all the state board members, and it says, to the Indiana State Board of Education from Representatives Bob Baining and Ed Clare, dated October 1st, regarding the implementation of HEA 1005 remediation. During the 2013 legislative session, the General Assembly passed on a bipartisan fashion HEA 1005 to substantially reduce the amount of remedial courses students must take after earning their high school diploma. According to 2011 graduation data from the Commission for Higher Education, 10,626 high school graduates who enrolled in an Indiana public college were required to take remedial courses. HEA 1005 required the State Board of Education, in consultation with the Department of Education, the Commission for Higher Education, the Education Roundtable, and the Department of Workforce Development, to adopt implementation guidelines by July 1, 2013, so that schools may begin implementing during the 2013-14 school year. As you know, the State Board of Education adopted interim guidance during the July 19th meeting that focuses solely on students who have failed their end-of-course assessments. However, the Commission for Higher Education data shows that our remediation problem is not limited to just the population of students failing ECAs. More than 7,000 students graduating with a Core 40 diploma needed remediation, and more than 9,500 students who received a non-waiver diploma needed remediation upon enrolling in college. It is our opinion that the interim guidance does not meet the intent of the law, and most importantly, will not reach a substantial pool of students who are in need of additional assistance. These concerns were shared with the Education Roundtable during their September meeting, and most recently in a meeting with Superintendent Ritz and her staff on September 30th. We were pleased to hear that Superintendent Ritz's support of our efforts and her agreement to expand the pool of students during the school year to include those students, both juniors and seniors, who have passed the ECAs but nonetheless require remediation. Part of our conversation centered around using PSAT scores as an additional indicator to determine which students are on a path to college and career readiness. As you may know, Ivy Tech and Vincennes currently use PSAT scores to determine readiness, so we fully support the inclusion of such indicators. We greatly appreciate the superintendent's willingness to expand the pool of students who qualify for the additional assessment tool and her commitment to prioritize existing DOE funding to ensure expanded implementation. While we support the department's willingness to share best practice with schools when it comes to remediation processes, we do not believe that delaying implementation is acceptable or fair to the students who will leave with a high school diploma only to enroll in college and find out they need remediation. We believe that given the proper tools to identify which students need additional assistance, local teachers, principals, and superintendents are more than capable to tailor remedial interventions that will help our students succeed in college and the workforce. We respectfully request that the State Board of Education revise the interim guidance adopted in July no later than the November meeting to ensure that an expanded pool of students receive the intervention they need during the current school year. Thank you for your time, and please don't hesitate to contact us with any questions you may have. So I'll ask Laura to include those in the minutes as well.
And as noted earlier, we're going to bring back those revisions in the November meeting.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we're ready for the November meeting dates. It is suggested.
We have 2 more updates.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to give you an update on the Strategic Planning Committee, as well as talk a little bit more about the hearing at Glenwood that we talked about earlier. So just a reminder before I talk about the committee that it says in statute 2019-214 that the duties of the state board include the following: establish the education goals of the state, develop standards and objectives for local school corporations, assess the attainment of the established goals, and assure compliance with established standards and objectives. At the July 19th State Board of Ed meeting, board members discussed the need to engage in a strategic planning process to establish clear K-12 goals and objectives, a detailed plan for achieving those goals, and clear metrics by which to measure progress toward these goals. At our last meeting, September 4th, board members adopted a resolution to create a strategic planning committee as a working group to provide oversight and direction to the board as it engages in a strategic planning effort. The planning process will engage the entire board, as well as education and other community stakeholders from around the state. And the goal is for the board to adopt a strategic plan no later than February of next year. The committee, which is subject to the open door law, is going to hold a kickoff meeting next Wednesday, October 9th, 2:30 to 4 p.m. in the Senate chambers, and will be live streamed. The meeting materials will be posted by October 7th. At that meeting, we'll have 4 different consultants will make their proposal to the committee about how they would propose to engage with the committee and the full board in that planning process. And Ann Davis and I have spoken with each of those consultants and specifically asked them to propose a plan that would make effective use of the committee as a working group to move the strategic planning effort forward both efficiently and effectively, engage the full board and also other stakeholders throughout the state, and help the board come up with a plan that it adopts in February. I'm happy to take questions about that. I sent an email earlier today to the full board. Is that clear? Any questions on that?
Thank you for your exceptional work in that.
Okay, great. The second, I just wanted to make clear about the Glenwood Leadership Academy hearing and the resolution that was adopted earlier. The past practice was to hold that hearing in the 5th year, which would be the spring, and that would allow ample time to gather input from the community, and so the board could make an informed decision when the grades were issued about what the intervention should be. So I respectfully request that the State Board of Ed staff work with Superintendent Ritz and the department staff once that grade is calculated, and maybe even hold a hearing as soon as this month or November. I know we have a very busy couple of months, lots of very important work to do, but I am cognizant of the fact that we are now in the 7th year, and if it is actually placed in the 6th, the bottom category, we're well into that 7th year. And in addition, it's a good reminder when those grades are issued, the state board actually has responsibilities for schools in year 1 and in year 3. So once we get that list, I know Sarah had asked for that and mentioned that a list had been distributed that she had not received. So once we get that updated list, it's actually, I don't know how long that list is going to be. The State Board of Ed actually has many obligations with respect to those schools. Finally, I wanted to turn it over to Michelle and James Betley, and I want to introduce James. James is an attorney with the Center for Education and Career Innovation, and Michelle asked James to do some work on the RISE 2.5 analysis that the board had asked for, and she did not want to work on it as she had represented the department and done some work in her prior role. So I will turn it over to Michelle and to James for their update.
Hi, I am just going to, as quickly as possible, go through some of the legal updates. I know there had been some questions, so this is a good opportunity for folks to ask questions about those. I do want to quickly talk about the agenda. It continues to be a hotly debated topic, and Anne mentioned it as well. But I do want to clarify, because there seems to be some misinformation about what the legal requirements or statutory requirements are for agenda setting. The law, when it comes to the State Board of Education, specifies that Superintendent Ritz is the chairperson and that there shall be a secretary. The law does specify the responsibilities of the secretary for the board, but it does not specify the requirements of the chair. Since we don't have any statutory direction about who is responsible for the agenda setting or how items get on there, or how we're going to conduct proceedings, we have shared governance procedures, and we need to defer to those in order to understand how this is going to work, and we can start focusing more on students and less on process. In those shared governance procedures, there is specific language about agenda items, and I'm just going to really quickly read it. But it does state that both the chair and the board members may add items to each board agenda. Reporting or discussion items may be added to the agenda before the meeting or may be added during a meeting, as is consistent with Indiana Code 5-14-1.5. I won't read this entire section, but there is a requirement that they have to be submitted 10 business days in advance, which is effectively 2 weeks when we're looking at business days, right? So I did want to clarify that because we're getting email messages from the public as well as questions from board members about whether the members themselves can actually insist on items being placed on the agenda. My reading of the governance procedures is that if a board member requests an item to be added to the agenda, then they would be reflected on the agenda. Also, the governance procedures do specify that Superintendent Ritz, as the chair, is responsible for the provision of the agenda.
The 10 days for duty you just mentioned is for action items only. Is that correct, that we need to distinguish between action items and items for discussion or other parts? And as I read your legal opinion, there's no timeline requirement for that. That could be entered even during the meeting, potentially.
Yes, items that don't require a vote, such as a resolution or an action item, could be added during the meeting.
If you need to suspend the rules to advance something, you can do that as well.
Well, so our shared governance procedures don't incorporate Robert's rules by reference, but frequently that's what bodies choose to follow. And I will say that Robert's rules do allow for that. So it might be if we end up revisiting the shared governance procedures, we could choose to incorporate by reference Robert's rules to address process for any areas in which we don't have sufficient clarity based within the shared governance procedures themselves.
A colleague was right when that came up. They said, well, you could always, in a cooperative spirit, add something. And so those are the norms. There's special circumstances.
My other question pertains to motions made by a board member. Do our policies or statutes or anywhere indicate that a motion from a board member must be approved in order to be made?
No, the shared governance procedures, and I think they're posted on the DOE website, they do not address recognition, the process for recognition of a motion being made. And again, if we...
The motion made and seconded it as on a state board, though it's unusual just to say, well, we're not going to recognize it, wouldn't you say?
I do not
I
have
don't
a
remember
huge
ever seeing
background, but
that.
I would point to my colleague James, who has come to us from Ice Miller, where he did lots of nonprofit law, and he might want to...
Generally, since the statute's silent on the matter, you're governed by the shared governance procedures which you did adopt. And I would say that because the shared governance procedures say that items require a resolution or a vote must be submitted 10 days before a board meeting, I mean, you could...
If it requires a
I
vote,
would say that probably you're governed by those rules since you did adopt them as a board.
if it requires a vote, then.
Yeah, I would say that. But that would be all items. So just to pick an example, the motion that was brought earlier during the meeting, which was allowed for hearings, technically would be in violation of the rules because it was not brought before the board and the board meeting. Just to give an example.
So our shared government procedures do need some review.
Yeah, I mean,
It seems too
it would
constricted.
apply equally to any motion. It's not just motions that, I guess what I'm saying is it would apply to any motion that wasn't brought before the state board administrator
Thank you.
10 days before the board meeting, as per your rules. So it does, in some ways, given, as Michelle said, your timelines and the various committees that are meeting. The Education Roundtable was a week ago. Something that came out of the Education Roundtable could not be put on the board as an action item simply because your board wouldn't allow it. So it limits you in.
Thank you.
So it may be fruitful for our next meeting to have an action item that will review our board procedures, because it seems to me during the board meeting, issues come up. And to have to wait till the next meeting sometimes does not make sense. Like, for example, having hearings that we mentioned today, it doesn't make sense to delay that until we have a 10-day notice to our November meeting. And so I would request now, I think it's 10 days before our next meeting, hopefully, that item be added as an action item, that we review it and potentially have some recommendations
I
at
might
that
make a
meeting.
comment here, and I'll have to have a conversation with Governor Pence. But it was our office and the governor's office who initiated these shared governance or operations, and they really weren't up for discussion before this board. They were voted on and approved by them, but they were really between two offices that said, this is how we would like to operate this year, between the two groups. And so I would like this conversation to be deferred so that I can have the opportunity to have that dialogue, because that's how they were originally developed, between the two offices. And so I want to go back and review that process.
We're going
Do you
to
have-
revisit.
Do you have other things that you want to speak
Just
to?
Very quickly, we mentioned in the legal update that there was an open door law complaint filed against the board for adding an action item that was not listed on the agenda. I did want to give an update that we have filed our response to that. And as we talked about earlier in the meeting, several hours ago, that the open door law does seem to be quite clear that action items under open door law, that's shared governance are a different matter, but under open door law may be added during a meeting, irrespective as to whether they are listed on the agenda. Sarah is no longer here, but she had questions about the Common Core pause piece and the
I just want to also point out that that item that was added to the agenda was actually requested to be added to the agenda as an action item 10 days before the board meeting. So
Which item?
the strategic planning, there was an email sent. There was an email sent. The subject of the open door complaint was the strategic planning. It was brought up by Mr. Elsner, and the item was actually requested to be added to the agenda as an action item in an email. It was sent to the State Board Administrator 10 days before the board meeting, so it was properly requested as well, just to make that clear. So it didn't violate either the open law or the procedures.
And so the next piece that I was going to was based on a request from Sarah, who's no longer here, but there was a recommendation I had made that we might want to revisit some of the guidance going out regarding which curricular standards are to be given, which curriculum standards should apply for grade 2 because of 1427, which is the under 1427. I think we're all pretty familiar now, but that's what has us looking at Common Core standards again, and we're calling it the pause. So the State Board of Education was prohibited from taking actions following May 15th, 2013, but any actions or decisions made by the State Board of Education prior to May 2013 were able to continue. One of the decisions made by the State Board prior to May 15th, 2013 was the way that we were going to roll out Common Core starting in kindergarten, which was 2 years ago, and now those kiddos would be in second grade. For those students, the guidance going out now is to receive instruction both in Common Core and Indiana standards. And so that's a difference for those students because before they were receiving instruction on Common Core alone, and we're not entirely confident that the language of 1427 required us to change the way that that's being rolled out, because that was a decision made prior to May 15th, 2013.
I would say, with hands down, that's the decision that could be going forward legally. But those little second graders will not be taking a Common Core only test when they are third graders. They will be taking a test that not only includes Common Core, but also Indiana academic standards. So for teachers to just teach the Common Core in grade 2 will not fully prepare the students for their exam in 14-15 on ISTEP. So the decision from the department had absolutely nothing to do with the rights of going forward. Fully, that was understood. The guidance was for instruction only because we're giving an ISTEP test when those little ones are grade 3. And so it had nothing to do with moving ahead with just Common Core for grade 2. It had everything to do to be sure that students are ready for an assessment they're going to take when they're third graders, which was not going to be totally aligned to college and career ready standards of just Common Core.
And if I may, I was trying to be quick because it's nearly 4 o'clock and I was kind of skimming over what was a multiple page memo in the legal update. So I think my attempt to be succinct causing me to not be very thorough. But, all I have done is recommend a conversation about this, which was, since originally the department had planned to administer the park assessment for 14-15, and we all know how assessments work, we didn't have ISTEP. We weren't planning to administer ISTEP for 14-15 because we were going to do park, which means we didn't have sufficient ISTEP items. So in order to administer ISTEP for 14-15, we're going to have to order additional items, no matter what. And theoretically, you would be able to order those items to look however you want, to reflect the standards, because that's what assessments do.
How are we going to get to this?
Well, it's a discussion item. It could be discussed at any time. Originally, I thought that we would probably do the board staff updates earlier in the meeting when we're more fresh and willing to talk about things. But I do think it's a conversation that should be had as to what that guidance should be. Granted, now we're in October, soon we'll be in November for the curricular year, and teachers are likely already planning what
I
they're.
think looking at our shared governance is going to be real important, because this is an interest to the board, and we're at a time where we should be able to concentrate on this, and so we need to look where things are in the agenda and all.
I think are you finished?
Oh, I was just going to highlight one final thing that I think will be really useful, and Brad was a participant on this call. At our last meeting, there was a lot of discussion about potential monies available for schools, our chronically underperforming schools in Indiana that the state board has intervened with. And at our last meeting, the board had received information that there really weren't any dollars available for George Washington. Since that time, there has been communication, and I know that I had recognized areas that I think dollars would have been available. We had a great phone call with the department yesterday. Brad was a participant. Cindy Hurst was on there from the department. Ann was on there, and Maggie Pano, an attorney from the department. And everyone did agree that we do have some additional monies available. There's another pot of what we'll call allowable dollars. It doesn't mean available, because but there are allowable, and actually this year they are still available, which is the 5% administrative set aside under little a. It's 5% of $9 million. So some real dollars, so that if for any reason these schools that we have intervened with as a board, if the intervention isn't working or you need to modify it, you no longer need to think about those schools as not having, you no longer need to think of yourself as the board as not having accessible dollars.
And Michelle, we indicated that in our initial presentation, that we had that pool of money available going forward. It just wasn't available to George Washington. I think Maggie may even have some, Charlie. Oh, Charlie's here. We went and did some further investigation to be sure that we were going to be correct in making sure that those monies weren't available to George Washington, because that was the topic of discussion. So Charlie, if you could go up for just a second and clarify some things, that would be great.
Yes, because that's actually inconsistent with what was said in our phone call yesterday. In our phone call yesterday, it was confirmed that if for George Washington, because until today we weren't sure until Dr. Farabee had said yes, we're using Davenport, and yes, it's definitely going to happen. There was some concern that the board might need to revisit George Washington, and we wanted to know whether or not there might be dollars available for funding an intervention. And that was listed as an allowable pot of dollars that could potentially be utilized.
So let me have Charlie address.
Brad, what did you hear? I heard it. I think there's been an update.
Let me have Charlie talk to you.
Superintendent Board, thanks for letting me come and talk for a few minutes. I know it's late in the day. Brad, thank you for a great conversation yesterday. I really appreciate that opportunity to discuss it. So when we think about George Washington, after our discussion yesterday, myself, Maggie Pano, and a few others, I went back to the ESEA waiver to really double check and make sure that those dollars, the administrative set aside from a 1003 little a, can be used for George Washington. What we've learned is that, or what we believe, what we're questioning is probably a better way to say it, is that we believe that the little a dollars, the administrative dollars, cannot be used for George Washington. They can be used for turnaround options for those schools that do qualify. And here's why George Washington doesn't qualify. On page 100 of the waiver, if you're interested in what page number, it indicates that in 2011-12 is the baseline year in order for school grades to be considered. In the 2011-12 year, George Washington was a C. Now, it's different from what they were previously, but that's the baseline year according to the waiver. The waiver also indicates that 1003 Little A dollars must be used for focus and priority schools. Focus and priority schools are schools been rated a D or an F. So according to the waiver, the 1003 Little A dollars cannot be used for George Washington technically. They can be used for turnaround type option interventions and things that we might like to do, but George Washington itself does not qualify under the waiver.
I just would add, I had a quick conversation with Danielle, if I have this wrong, but I believe the issue on George Washington was resolved by the fact that there are Title I dollars at the school that can be steered to the vendor.
Yeah,
That
let me
was
talk,
my
yeah,
Correct.
let me talk
Yeah,
about
which is a good
that.
option.
Yeah.
But I want to affirm that what Michelle was saying was exactly what I heard on the phone, so.
Correctly. And so let me talk to you about leveraging dollars. The department has never done this. They have never leveraged Title I dollars to specifically go towards certain things at a school. We get applications from the schools, we read the applications, and we approve them and we submit the dollars. Currently, I actually am leveraging special education dollars to be used in a very particular way for a school corporation that has some issues that we need to be getting addressed. Has never been done before. I'm serious about accountability. I'm serious about school improvement. And so the department itself, actually, when we distribute those Title I dollars, if we feel we have needs for students, for schools to improve in a certain particular way or using certain kinds of things, we may be exercising our right at the department to actually see how those dollars are being spent within the application process when the schools apply. So I can tell you that yes, we have some opportunity to leverage some Title I dollars for school improvement. The department will look at that going forward in our application process. I think that's important to note, that's how serious I am, in particular, to making sure that schools are going to be improving. And to answer your question, because Brad was concerned that we didn't have dollars available to make sure that school improvement things were going to go forth. And so we have investigated this other option. In practice, it's not been done before at the department, but I have already begun that practice in another area, and so we're not opposed to doing that.
Maybe in strategic planning, we'll make this more clear and discuss it, but it would seem once the board decides to intervene in some schools, that would be the priority where we put our dollars, or not individuals within the department. And what we can talk that through, because you always want to align your dollars with the board established priorities. You don't change and switch. We went through a lot of years of working with these schools, and we wanted to make them better, and so that's why it was a priority. And we wanted to make sure the resources were available to follow through with the priority. Correct?
Well, I think it should be noted that in the waiver, and George Washington wasn't even on the list that was submitted, like literally.
Well, and part of our analysis was based on the representation in September, was repeatedly said, under the waiver, George Washington is a priority school. But just for clarification, that perhaps for right now it isn't. Once the grades are assigned and, if they get calculated in a week and then there's a 30-day appeals window, finalized in November or December, my understanding is we anticipate George Washington being a D. As soon as they receive that D, they will once again become a priority school, and those administrative dollars will become available. So for some of this correction is kind of all for naught, because ultimately the point of this is, if for some reason we do need some dollars for George Washington, there are some allowable dollars. There is allowable and available dollars to be used.
I think it's important to note they're not available today.
I understand
Going
that.
forward,
My
they
question
potentially
is
could
so
be.
the board can be proactive in meeting its statutory
Correct.
obligation, as Dr. Elsner is saying.
And I've always been in sync with that.
I move we adjourn.
We have,
Excuse
excuse
Oh,
me,
we still have that? Oh, dear. Okay.
we have what?
As Claire stated, I authored the RISE 2.5 memo just because there was we wanted an appearance of impropriety just because of Michelle's previous experience with the DOE. So if there were any questions, I know that it came up an hour or two ago.
I just want to get it back on the agenda at a future meeting. I'd like to revisit that.
Is that the board's responsibility, Superintendent?
Well, it's a little unclear. Part of the memo, as you can see in the summary, was that we sort of had a couple of concerns, and one of the concerns was a procedural, and it was sort of who was responsible for developing the model in the first place. And the statutory language, without reading the entire memo, the statutory language simply provides that, let me see if I can find it here, the board shall, before January 31st, work with the department to develop a model plan, and that's it. And then it says any subsequent versions must be released to school corporations. However, it doesn't speak to who's responsible, who has the authority to make revisions. Now, in practice, RISE 1.0 was piloted and then turned into RISE 2.0. And throughout that whole procedure, as you can read in the memo, there was constant dialogue between the board and the DOE, and there were reports released that were public, et cetera, et cetera. So it was an open process. Our concern with this, with RISE 2.5, was that there wasn't the same sort of open process. Now, given the ambiguity in the statute, we read it to mean that we're supposed to work together. I mean, it's a collaborative process. It makes sense. So, our recommendation was simply that the board revisit, maybe ask some questions, since they were not given an opportunity to ask questions while it was being developed, as they were with RISE 1.0 and 2.0, particularly because we also had concerns about whether or not RISE 2.5 satisfied the legal requirements of the statute. And given that school corporations are permitted by statute to rely on the model, because it is the department's model, that they might be exposing themselves to liability by relying on a model that in fact does not comport with the statute. So,
I'll take that. I'll put that in
so
consideration.
if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them, but that was the gist of it. It's all in the memo.
Thank you very much. November meeting dates, I'm suggesting that we meet on November 6th, and then we also meet on the following Wednesday, November 13th, because we have a great deal to talk about, mostly A to F accountability systems. Is that acceptable? 2 Wednesdays in a row? All right, seeing no further business.
I would just like to say briefly, as a first-time board member, just the public comment phase of the meeting, given the length of today's meeting and the fact that we're going to have 2 November meetings, I would just respectfully request that the rules which limit each member of the public to 5 minutes be adhered to in the interest of time. For everybody's sake, and I just, of course, value the opinions of the members of the public who are coming and spending their time expressing their opinions to this board. At the same time, I felt that there were some comments made by the public that were multiple pages in length, and I think we can encourage the members of the public to be a little bit more succinct, and if they have extended comments, that those can be submitted in writing for the record and for all of us to review at a later time. Thank you.
What I could do is when I publish the agenda, we could put out there 5 minutes speaking time.
Or even shorter.
Thank you. Motion to adjourn? Second?